Do you have any thoughts on this concept? And I know your take on this, but I'm curious because it's something that I've been playing around with in clinical practice. Is this idea of protein cycling? And I don't know if there is benefit, but perhaps there may be benefit to going through periods of, and of course, nobody knows the answer to this, more significant methionine restriction and just overall protein restriction, in a cyclic nature.
I think all of these sort of cyclic or intermittent fasting kinds of things are kind of interesting to think about. And even some of the longevity studies, people like Steve Simpson now are showing that the intermittent fasting actually is equal to just long-term chronic restriction. And and so I think that,
And is that a calorie issue? The intermittent fasting, is it a clock gene time restriction, or is that an overall caloric?
nobody really knows for sure. There's some theories as to what it might be, but um, people have done things where they've kind of restricted intermediate, and the calorie difference isn't that big. I mean, usually it's a calorie restriction, but surprisingly, it doesn't just relate to body fat. So, you'd think, well, it's a body restriction, it's a calorie restriction, therefore it just means you have less body fat. And we know
Mm,
that obesity is not a healthy thing to do. But that doesn't seem to quite hold up.
mm.
So it is an energy issue. It may relate to a protein issue. That's certainly one of the discussions, or putting it less politely, arguments going on out there.
Yeah, we definitely can get to some of that. Let's talk a
Yeah.
little bit about branched chain amino acids, the necessity, the potential benefits from taking branched chain amino acids as it relates to pre-workout.
Yeah.
Do you take them
I think
pre-workout?
I think the important thing to realize what the branched chain amino acid story really is, and going back to sort of what we discovered with leucine and mTOR, leucine and mTOR represent a recovery from a catabolic time. So when we go into a fasting period, like a short-term 12-hour overnight fast, the system down regulates and sort of saves energy. It shuts everything down. And that means we turn off a whole series of initiation factors. And until we have enough leucine to turn that back on, we stay sort of in that fasting state. And so leucine is effective to sort of recover from a fasting state. So almost all the research on leucine has been shown at the first meal of the day, breakfast.
And that's interesting that it's
And the other time it's been shown, and we actually were the first to show it, is after endurance exercise.
mm,
Endurance exercise also turns off protein synthesis, probably an energy issue in both cases. And what we showed is that leucine could cause a recovery of that. And that's really where the whole leucine story came from. I mean, Tracy and Josh and Jamie Baum were in the lab, and Greg Paul, and we all were looking at this recovery after endurance exercise and showed that leucine would recover it. So again, benefit of branched chain amino acids, well, it's a recovery mechanism. So then you have to think about, when are you trying to recover? Well, small meals, a breakfast meal. Do you have enough leucine to get a recovery? How about a small lunch meal? And by small, I mean a meal where you won't have enough overall amino acids. And what we showed was having around 30 grams of protein
mm,
was enough. And the reason for that is that in a mixed kind of diet like most Americans eat, leucine makes up about 8% of the protein. So 30 grams gives you about 2.5 grams of leucine, and that's will turn it on. So that's where kind of all those numbers came from. So again, I think after exercise might be useful, certainly at small meals.
but after
People,
exercise for recovery as it relates to muscle would probably require the full spectrum of amino acids.
sure. So that's exactly right, is that again, what leucine is a trigger to turn on the system for initiation. And as soon as you turn on the trigger, then you have to have all the amino acids to make it work. So, should you take in branched chain amino acids or should you take in whey protein? Well, obviously, you should take in the protein because
Right,
it's a complete mixture.
right. And then, so the post recovery benefits would be if you're going to take branch chains and you utilize branch chains alone, you don't necessarily, sometimes you don't like to eat after you train, right? There would be,
There is some parallel data out there that branch chains may reduce the level of soreness
mhm,
after it. So I often use a branch chain supplement after a hit type of workout, a high intensity workout. Uh, just sort of as a exercise recovery, but I just mix it into a water, a hydration drink, and I just mix it in. And, I like doing it that way. If somebody asked me, could I really prove it made any difference? I'd be hard pressed to prove it.
but it's interesting, the data, and actually I've seen from some of the talks that you've given, the branched chain amino acids do a lot more than just help with muscle recovery. And arguably even other amino acids like arginine for vasodilation, and there's some amino acids that help leucine with CPT1 for fatty acid oxidation. So there's a lot of other benefits.
Sure. I mean, all of the essential amino acid have other roles, like arginine for nitric oxide, or lysine for CPT1 for fatty acid transport into the mitochondria, or tryptophan for serotonin. So you can kind of go on down the list. And what people tend to think about is amino acids just as building blocks for new proteins, which really is kind of the RDA. It's kind of the minimum number,
Mhm.
but the actual number is more metabolic, and that requires a much higher level of amino acids.
And that's interesting. So I'm wondering where that optimal zone would be, because everybody just focuses on the amino acids as it relates to muscle protein synthesis, but that's really just the bare bones for
Yeah,
muscle health. It's not,
yeah,
if you don't have enough for that, then you're not having enough for, the other aspects, whether it's
yeah.
neurotransmitters or CPT1 or,
And there,
vasodilation.
there are different ways of looking at that from a sort of a normal physiology standpoint. I've never seen any case where going to two times the RDA doesn't supply enough. A lot of what we're looking for is changing in the blood or intracellular concentration, because all of these things are what we might call substrate driven. So as the concentration in the cell goes up, you stimulate the pathway. But then you get into individual cases like tryptophan, for example, and to actually get the average intake of tryptophan is about 1 gram per day. And to
Mhm.
actually get a serotonin effect in more of a clinical standpoint, most of those doses are in the 6 gram range. So those are beyond food source levels. I mean, you just can't get to that kind of level.
Right.